Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Bryan. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
We're going to be switching things up a little bit here today. Fellas, I'm going to need you to take a back seat because, ladies, this episode is for you. Now, you see, as my Instagram community continues to grow, I keep hearing louder and louder calls from my female followers for men to be more vulnerable. And then simultaneously, the men in my community say they aren't so sure the women in their lives really want our vulnerability. You see, many men are gun shy, and rightfully so, for having been burned from opening up emotionally in the past, only to have it work against them in a variety of ways that we'll discuss in specifics later in this episode. So to bridge this vulnerability gap, because we all know men do need to be more vulnerable and feel safe being more vulnerable in romantic partnership so that intimacy can deepen, I decided to run a little survey in my Instagram community where I asked a very simple question of the men. What would you need to be more vulnerable with your romantic partner? And I got about 100 illuminating responses from these men, of which I've culled down 5 core themes, which Bryan and I will be discussing in today's episode. So in this episode, we'll talk about the specific ways in which men have been burned in the past by being vulnerable and the repercussions for that and why they may be gun shy to open up again in the future. We'll talk about what Brené Brown and Bell Hooks, who's a legendary feminist author, have to say about why men are hesitant to be vulnerable. Of course, we'll talk about the 5 things that men have asked for, men need to be more vulnerable with you. And then we'll also talk about what the man's responsibility is in each of these 5 categories, because there's 2 that tango in every one of these relationships. And so it's not just what men need, it's also we're calling forward men to say, if you want this, here's your ante that you need to put up in the table. So if you're in a relationship, this would be an excellent episode to listen to together with your partner and discuss afterwards. It'd be great to, if you're exploring a new relationship dynamic with a partner, could make a great virtual date and discussion afterwards. Or if you're rolling solo like me, not in a partnership, and you just want to learn how to have better, deeper, more vulnerable conversations for those partnerships in the future, I think you'll get a lot out of this episode. So enjoy this conversation directed towards the ladies. 5 things men need to be more vulnerable with you. All right, buddy, I got to ask you a question that I need you to be completely honest with me about. For most of your adult life, in your romantic partnerships, when a woman asked you to be vulnerable with her, did you believe that she really wanted you to be fully vulnerable with her?
I mean, the first thought that comes to my mind is, can you handle this?
Right.
If I'm really going to be vulnerable, can you handle this? And it never comes across that way. It hasn't in my history of a partner has never said, will you be vulnerable with me? But the intent is there in a lot of the conversations that I've had where would you be more open? Would you tell me how you really feel? Right. And that same question comes up in my mind. Can you handle this?
Yeah. I think there's general suspicion amongst, I would say, majority of men that when a woman's asking for him to be vulnerable, they're kind of like, I don't know if you really want me to. Either because I've been vulnerable in the past and I've been burned, or I've been vulnerable in the past, I've been judged, or I've had sex withheld, or whatever it is, that I think there's a general suspicion that, I don't think you're ready to handle what I've got going on in this inner world here.
There's some sort of repercussion that's going to happen, right? And it's not going to be a good one, typically, if I'm vulnerable. I've heard women say this too, where they don't want to fully express themselves to their partners because they're not sure that we can handle all of them.
Yeah, sure.
I think this is something that certainly goes both ways, but we hear about it more feminine going the masculine. What we're talking about is the masculine being on the vulnerable side.
Right. This episode was inspired by a poll that I ran on my Instagram account the other day, asking the male followers, when your woman wants you to be more vulnerable with you, what do you need from her in order to meet that request? I got probably about 100 answers from men, which was surprising to me. I didn't know if that many guys were going to really respond to it, but I got probably about 100 responses that we have, kind of culled down into 5 themes that men are asking for in order to feel safe in being vulnerable. And I thought that we would take this opportunity to actually record an episode just for our women listeners. And also, guys, like, hopefully you're listening too here to see, like, did we get this right? And do you feel vindicated and heard and seen? Because we've obviously been in your shoes too.
Well, and I know from the guy's perspective, when you and I went through this list prior to recording, it was easier for me to identify, like, yes, that's I have felt that before. I didn't know what the words were, but like, that's the thing.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to go through this list of 5. The first one that we're starting with that men have asked for in order to be more vulnerable with their women in romantic partnerships. This number 1 answer came up in 50% of the responses that I got. We could really do the entire episode on just this one and then end it here, because if we would want women to take away anything, it's this one. Don't judge me. The number 1 answer we got was a request for non-judgment. And I'm going to, instead of using our own words, I'm going to go to the expert on shame, Brené Brown, because we all love Brené. Here's what Brené Brown has to say about this. Men are smart. They hear us asking for their vulnerability, but are also very aware that we may act scared or resentful when they show their vulnerable side. You wouldn't believe how often men tell me, I pretend to be vulnerable, but I keep it under control. Or I give her just enough to believe I'm being open, because if I were totally truthful about how afraid or out of control I feel, she would judge me. And underneath the pretending lies hurt, disappointment, and shame. She goes on to say that shame is the most powerful master emotion. It's the fear that we're not good enough. For men, it's the fear of not being wealthy enough, tough enough, or smart enough. The number 1 shame trigger for men is being perceived as weak. Men walk this tightrope where any sign of weakness elicits shame, and so they're afraid to make themselves vulnerable for fear of looking weak. But if you can't be vulnerable, then you can't truly grow and be your best self. Women can either embrace and help men walk across the tightrope, or we can be the ones who push them off.
Gay Hendricks is, we've referenced several of his books here before, but kind of a relationship psychologist, if you will. And he talks about that last point that you just mentioned. Like, we can't grow in a relationship unless we're able to go to those places, which we're calling vulnerability, to say where we're truly at. And I've been in relationships like that. And I can tell you, they get boring pretty quick. As a guy, it's surprising how fast I will move from being okay being vulnerable and open with where I'm at to, with one shutdown, with one time, be like, oh, I'm not doing that again.
Yep.
And so that part where Brené Brown said that I give just enough so they think that I'm vulnerable, it serves the purpose of them thinking, my partner thinking that I'm vulnerable, but it doesn't get us into that Gay Hendricks area of actual growth within the relationship. And guys go through years, I know I have, of just kind of mediocre-ish relationship where I'm not rocking the boat too much. Right. I'm not going to say something that's, quote, vulnerable, that's going to trigger my partner in a way that's going to have some sort of repercussion that I don't want to deal with.
Right. And so we're always tiptoeing around the elephant in the room, and we're never really getting anywhere. And so to take this a step further, some of the responses that we heard around, this experience of being judged after opening up, it's, if I show weakness, then she's no longer sexually attracted to me. Or if I show doubt or fear, then she no longer trusts my leadership, right? And then from that point forward, when I try to lead in the relationship, she questions me or nitpicks me or tries to break it down. It feels like she doesn't trust me in the same way anymore. And so many men have had that experience of, I've opened up, I've shared, and then it has negative repercussions in the future. And like you just said, they've learned never to do it again, right? So they become gun shy. We've become gun shy. I think one of the other important parts of this is, inside of each of these categories of 5 things that we need, it's also important to talk about what is a man's responsibility in this equation. Because if we're trying to create a situation where I can be heard by my partner without judgment, then I think there's also certain responsibilities on my side that can allow her to step into that space. For example, if I'm opening up to my partner and just hitting her over the head with, I'm now $75,000 in debt. I've got a gambling problem. I do heroin on the side and I watch 6 hours of porn a day. Don't judge me. That's a tall order, right? If we unleash a tornado, an avalanche of information on someone who is completely unsuspecting, that may be too much for them to handle. The other side of that is also if you're constantly leaking or upset, showing vulnerability all the time, and she becomes your therapist, right? And you have nowhere else to go and you've done no other work in processing your emotions with other guys or in therapy or with a coach, and you're just dumping it on her, then there's also probably some room where she's going to judge you because she's going to feel unsafe. Like, do you have anything in place to actually work through this shit? Or are you now my total responsibility? That feels heavy.
I've heard this described, that second part, I've heard this described as like dropping a grenade in my lap.
Yeah.
It's just like, hey, I'm overwhelmed. And if I just, I'm being vulnerable, right? I'm being vulnerable by saying that I'm overwhelmed. Great step, Bryan. You're doing great. But like, if I just leave it there,
right?
I haven't done any additional work, any additional thought on the implications of that or what I actually want or anything else. And so I'm using my partner as a therapist in that case.
Yeah. Or a trash bag. You're just like dumping your trash. And it's like, it can't just be a blah. Now you hold it. Sometimes you just need to be heard, right? Like, I'm overwhelmed. All I need you, like, we don't need to fix it in that. I just need you to hear that. But if there's something else that's like icky, mucky, and you're just dumping it on them and now it's their issue and you're not going to do anything about it and you're going to continue going on being overwhelmed, then probably you're opening yourself up to some judgment.
Right. On the guy's responsibility, there is some work to do other than just throwing a grenade or vomiting our emotions all over the place.
Yes. And we'll hit the point that we always do. This is why it's so important to do work with other men, because you can show some of this stuff. You can really break it down, let the guys help sort through that so that when you come back to your partner, then at least she can feel that you're doing the work, right? All right. So that's number one, what men crave, non-judgment. And that was the biggest one that we heard back from everybody.
Real quick, on number one, let's go back for 1 second, because I'm now thinking about, like, well, what is not non-judgment? What does that look like?
Yeah.
What are we looking for when we bring vulnerability? And let's say it's refined in some way, that we've done some of the work on our own. What does non-judgment look like?
Yeah. Do you have any examples of that?
Yeah. I think it's this kind of non-reactive state. And I think this could be applied to number one, number two, number three, whatever they are. But like getting curious around what it is the guy's bringing you. So if it's something you can imagine, like in the sexual nature, maybe it's vulnerability of desire. Yeah. Like, here's what I want in bed. This is something I want. Like, the judgment is, oh, you're not getting that from me. You're not getting that from the relationship. You're not like, well, maybe it has nothing to do with that. And so I think there is an element of curiosity, and there's also a time element to this. So something that we worry about as guys is there is the in the moment, I'm being vulnerable and we're talking right now. That's step one. But there's also the after effect. My concern is, like, is she going to go think about this now? And is it going to come back and bite me in the ass in a week, in a month? Where else is this coming back? And so I think it's important that, like, when there is a moment of vulnerability, there's a discussion, there's curiosity, and then there's also no backlash afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, is something that I said now is then going to be brought up in every future discussion. I think we've experienced that many times. It's like, but when you said that thing about not having enough sex, and then it's like, it's there every time after that. One of the safety mechanisms around don't judge me means, like, if we share it here, maybe there is work to be done in the future, but if we share it here, I also need to know that it's not going to be the thing that gets brought up every single time in the future.
I've talked about this one before. This is going back beginning of the pandemic 2 years ago. And I was really struggling with, like, what I'm doing from a career standpoint, from a business standpoint. And I was just stuck. I was feeling really, really stuck. I realized through a conversation with Becca, like, one of the reasons I was feeling stuck is because I felt like a failure. I felt like I was just like, I just failed in multiple levels. Like, I wasn't sure if I was going in the right direction. And I brought that to her. was like, God, like I feel like a failure. I was scared when I brought that to her.
It's a scary thing to tell.
I was like, is she like, the thoughts that went through my mind, is she going to think that I'm always going to be a failure? Is she going to think that she's with the wrong person and she maybe should go find a guy that's got his shit together and like maybe has a ton of money in the bank and, you know, has direction, and there's plenty of guys like that out there. Like, why is she going to stay with me? And when I brought that up, like, she got really curious around it. She's like, well, what makes you believe that you're a failure? Like, what was that? She helped me reframe some of the thinking I was there. And I got to tell you, that was one of our more connective moments that we had early in our relationship. And it was also incredibly scary going into it. And so I think that's when I think about vulnerability. I think about that story with Becca, where it's a good example of the tension was high for me. The anxiety was high for me, but I also didn't feel like I had a choice. I'm like, I got to get this out.
What did it feel like for you when she brought you curiosity versus judgment?
Oh, it felt like, I'm like, oh, wait, this is safe. Like, she didn't run out the door. Did I have lingering feelings after that she may still want to leave? You know, she's like, wait a second, I actually didn't sign up for this. Yes, I did have that.
Hangover.
It's a vulnerability hangover. Yeah. But that conversation came back several times, not in a judgment way where she was like, oh, like, because you're a failure, right? But like asking me about it and getting curious around, like, hey, like, how is that feeling for you now? When I've had success since then, she'd be like, do you remember when you were feeling like a failure? Like, how does this feel different?
Yeah.
Like, oh, like this totally feels different, you know? So the partners and the women listening to this, we can bring these subjects back up. It's not a topic to not talk about again, but we can do it in a way that's enriching to the relationship and breeds more vulnerability. Because after that, I was like, oh, like I can bring her a lot of stuff. And so just as easy as it is to shut off, it's also as easy to turn on when it's received in the right way.
Wow. That's a big point, man. That's a huge point. And big props to you, Becca, for being there for my boy during that time. I remember, we were going through that. I remember you talking about it and sharing with me how big Becca showed up. But I think what you just said about it's just as easy to turn off that spigot as it is to turn it on. And since that point where Becca showed up in like your lowest moment and provided that safety, and then allowed you to kind of process through that stuff, you're now like, I can bring her all the things. And I know you've brought her many of the things since that point in time. And maybe one more quote to finish up this section with comes from Bell Hooks, who's the legendary feminist author whose book I've proselytized many times in this podcast called The Will to Change Men, Masculinity, and Love. She passed away last year. Bell Hooks says that even with her being a feminist and wanting men and calling for men to open up and to tap into their feelings and to be vulnerable, that even she and many of the other feminists in her community can fall prey to, the patriarchal structures, the patriarchal teachings of men need to be invincible. And she shares this story. She says, when I was in my 20s, I would go into couples therapy and my partner of more than 10 years would explain how I asked him to talk about his feelings. But when he did, I would freak out. And he was right. It was hard for me to face that I did not want to hear about his feelings when they were painful or negative, that I did not want my image of the strong man truly challenged by learning of his weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Here I was, an enlightened feminist woman who did not want to hear my man speak his pain because it revealed his emotional vulnerability. And this is not a moment to shame women or to shame Bell Hooks or anyone who's been in that space before, but to just bring the awareness of even the most enlightened feminists who are calling for more emotional vulnerability for men, the conditioning that we've had in our society around suck it up, be a man, it runs deep. And if we can all just bring, shine greater light on that, we can start to release its power on ourselves. So now to point number two.
Now we can go to two.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you jumped in there, man, because there was some really powerful stuff there. The second thing that we need as men, and this is a phrase that I like to term as, don't over the top me when I'm being vulnerable with you. And over the top means if you're asking me to be vulnerable and you're now holding the space for me to be vulnerable and I'm now sharing emotions with you that somehow trigger you, don't come back over the top with me around your emotions to make it bigger than mine, where it's now about you and it's no longer about me. And an example of that from my history, and I know you're smiling over here because you've got examples of that too, is, in previous relationships where I've felt, and these were in some of my days where I wasn't really deep into the inner work, but, I'd feel, say, suffocated in a relationship. I would feel like I was carrying an inordinate amount of the emotional burden in the relationship, and there wasn't a lot of room for my emotions. So when it came time to have a conversation about that, where I would share, I don't think there's space for my emotions. When I try to bring things up, it's met with a couple of words and then it's back to you. And then in that moment, when I would share that, my partner would just freak out and be like, you know how hard this is for me. And I don't have, and you're the one who's got this strength and I'm not built like you. And, like bang, but bang, but bang, but bang. And in that moment, I'm like, oh, cool. It's no longer about me. I feel completely unseen, unheard. Here we go again. Now it's back to me space holding again. And that feels incredibly cumbersome. And I've learned my lesson that there's no space here. And eventually I would end up leaving those relationships for that reason. How does that land with you, man? Can you relate to any of that?
Well, it's subtle, right? Like you mentioned at the very end of that conversation was, well, I don't stay in those relationships very long, or I get out of them, right? And you probably didn't leave after the first one or the second one, maybe, but eventually over a period of time, you learned that I can't actually tell my partner what I'm feeling because it's going to trigger her in such a way that we can't actually talk about it. Because if you had to say, Dominic, in that, when you brought up suffocation, what percentage of that was Dominic's thing and something for you to work on versus like her doing something to you?
Yeah. So this is where I think it comes back to a man's responsibility in this side of the equation too, is there was a big part of my inner world that was shut down during that period of time. Like these are relationships I'm talking about maybe like 10 years ago, right?
Before you're better now.
Yeah.
You're totally
I'm much more involved now.
Yes.
But yeah, I would say a big part of it was like there were parts of me that were shut off. There were parts of me that when I entered into a relationship with a woman, I put forth that I am the guy who can listen to you and I want to hear your emotions because I'd like to be that white knight. And I fed off of being special. And so I set up a lot of that dynamic too. And I also maybe projected myself as being more perfect than I actually was. And so like the illusion when I started to share, like I'm grappling with something, it shattered her perception of who I'd positioned myself to be. So part of that was my responsibility. She was probably reacting in some regard to how I'd portrayed myself. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you said the word suffocated, I felt that suffocation in relationships. I maybe had 9 relationships in a row where I started to feel suffocated. And that told me maybe it's not them.
The common theme.
Yeah, maybe it's me, not you. Right. I got some work to do. Right. But what could happen, and this is why like partnership is so powerful, is if instead in that moment, there wasn't or maybe there was still a trigger, but there was a conversation about like tell me about your suffocation.
Right.
Like, where is that coming from? Have you felt it before?
What's that feel like for you?
Right? What's that feel like for you? Right. All of a sudden there's room for your emotion and there's a building of the relationship and they can mirror that. So like I had 9 in a row, 9 relationships in a row, let's say, that I was feeling that same thing, but never really grew from it. Right. Because I just left or ran or whatever. But I also wasn't with a woman that could stand there and in that fire. Right. And we're asking a lot here.
Right.
Right. But you're also asking a lot. You want us to be vulnerable? Cool. Like meet us there.
That's right. Yes. Like that's a huge piece here, man, is for the women who are asking for vulnerability from their men, are you equipped to handle what you're about to hear? You have to be honest with yourself. Like if you're not equipped to handle it, then you're really setting yourself up and the other person up for a disaster. It makes me think of, we all know the guys who go to their women and are like, early in relationships and like, yo, how many dudes have you slept with before me? Right? The guy who's typically asking that question is the very guy you do not want to answer that question for, because if you're like, oh yeah, I slept with 50 guys before you, he's the one who's going to explode and call you, he's going to have a lot to say about that. And he's asking for some reason because he's trying to figure out, is he safe in his own words in that relationship? But he can't handle what's coming back. And then it ends up catastrophizing the relationship, right? So there needs to be a level of self-awareness of, can you handle what could come back? One more piece on this around a man's responsibility in this section around don't over the top me if you're about to share something with your partner that does affect her, and it's maybe about like your relationship or how she's showing up, when you sit down to be vulnerable with her, you can set the space up where she doesn't feel like she's blindsided, right? So for example, like if I were to go back in time and to set it up where I'm going to share that like I'm feeling suffocated in this relationship, I may sit down with my partner, let's call her Jen, and say, hey, Jen, I'd like to share with you some stuff that's coming up for me in our relationship. And it's going to be potentially some heavy stuff that may be triggering for you. And I really need you to be in a position where you can hear it and handle that so that we can work through it together. Maybe that's not now, maybe it is now, but like where are you emotionally? And are you able to go there with me? And she might have been able to say like, not tonight, or maybe right now, or yes. And then that way she can kind of prepare herself to know that some hard stuff's coming the way. And that way she feels honored, seen, and respected before I just boom.
Right. Before you drop the grenade.
Blindside. Yeah.
Right. When you brought up the number 2, I had a big smile on my face because I remember some past relationships where I did this. I didn't set up the container right. And it was just like a cavalcade of disasterness that ensued because I was feeling overwhelmed. I used that word earlier in the podcast. I was in a moment of feeling overwhelmed. And so I went to my partner. I'm going to be vulnerable, guy. I'm working on myself. I'm feeling overwhelmed. That's what I said. Immediately before I could even set up the container, because I started with the emotion. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I was so proud of myself because I got there. I was about to say work things, like physically I'm not feeling well. There's like a whole bunch of things that contributed to this feeling of overwhelm. She immediately interrupted me and she's like, do you know how much work I've been doing? Like, do you know the responsibilities that I have? Like, and there was like 5 things that like clearly I had triggered a defensive piece of her that it was all about her.
Right.
And like why she can't be giving this relationship anymore because, and it literally had nothing to do with her. Or our relationship. It was like a 0%.
Yeah.
Right? I was just like there. But then we spent the next like 2 hours discussing why those things are true in her life. I left that feeling unseen, unheard, like
hijacked.
Completely hijacked. Yeah. Now, what I would have loved is to have that partner in that situation to be like, tell me about your overwhelm, right? But I could have also set it up better. I could have said, hey, I'm feeling some things related to work, related to my physical body that like it has me feeling overwhelmed. Would you be down to talk about that with me? Right. Like, so it goes both ways.
Yep.
And we as guys can do a better job of setting that up.
Beautiful. All right. So that second one was don't over the top me, which at the essence of it is if I'm sharing and I'm opening up, don't make it about you. Let's like be here for me when I'm sharing. Number 3, and this is something that you just mentioned. If I'm opening up to you, don't interrupt me. This is a big one, right? We know that men are famous in boardroom settings for man-terrupting. It seems in emotional situations, we hear from a lot of guys that feel like they're trying to formulate their thoughts. The words aren't coming out perfectly. They're not complete on their thread. And then bang, someone jumps in and interrupts. Their woman will jump in and interrupt them and just hijack their train of thought. And for guys, that can be really disequilibrating when we're trying to open up emotionally. Allison Armstrong, who's a wonderful coach that teaches women how to romantically relate to their men, in her book, The Queen's Code, which when I read that book, I'm like, oh my God, this describes me in a way that I've never had like a man write about before. She talks about how oftentimes, like at guys, we have a single train of thought. And if that single train of thought is interrupted, it kind of sends us back spiraling to the beginning and we lose we lose the space that we were in. And women with the best of intentions, many times, want to jump in and complete the thought, but it's not right on. It's not the thought that we were having, or they could become impatient and want us to finish the thinking. And that is like a surefire way to get a man's like emotional triggers up, especially when he's trying to figure out what it is he's feeling. Because sometimes it is harder for us to get to our emotions.
You use this word emotional fluency. This is when we were talking with guys that are starting their inner work path. This is where we start because guys are so terrible at it. Now I've been at this like 6 or 7 years. I am still incredibly slow to understand what I'm feeling. Here's what it takes for me. I need to sit down for a solid 20-minute meditation of silence to ask myself, what am I feeling in my body? What are the sensations? What emotions are coming up for me? It takes me a little while to do that. Now, take me out of that situation, put me in the heat of the moment with my partner when things are on the line. The chances of me finding the specific emotion in that moment and being able to articulate it is really low. And it takes me some time. Yeah. And sometimes I can't do it in that conversation. And it takes me going away for a few hours and coming back and being like, okay, I know what I was feeling. I was actually feeling anger. Yeah. I was feeling anger because this boundary was crossed. This is the boundary I'd like to talk about. Yep. Right? That's going to be a more productive conversation. But like in the moment, I don't know. I'm just feeling flustered. I'm feeling this. I'm feeling that. And if my partner were to say like, oh, is it because you're sad?
Right.
No, I don't think. I don't even know. Give me a second.
I don't know what I'm feeling. Well, actually, since you brought this up, this ties into the fourth thing that we need. And we'll talk about number 3, number 4 together. The fourth thing that we need is sometimes we need space and time to process our emotions and then to articulate them, come back and know what it was that we were feeling. So these two things together of don't interrupt me and give me space and time to process these feelings and emotions so I can come back and share with you what it is I'm feeling are really important. Now, one of the mechanisms that Alison Armstrong talks about in her book, The Queen's Code, about non-interrupting is first and foremost, just let a man speak, let him finish his thing. And when he finishes, ask him, is there anything else? Right? Just because he pauses, right, doesn't mean that he's done. It just means like maybe there's another thought that's formulating. Is there anything else? I use this all the time in my coaching, all the time. And I'll ask guys how they're feeling and they'll say something and I'll be like, wow, that's awesome. Is there anything else? And there'll be like a 20-second pause. Yeah, there is something else. Great. And I'll keep doing that until they've hit bottom, until I'm like, is there anything else behind that? I'm just curious and curious. And the gold comes out after the second or third time I ask it.
That's so true. The partners and women in these relationships, you can help facilitate us and get us to that point because like we're just not naturally or trained, right, to be there. And some partners are. Right. Some women like are just naturally in that language and they can feel it. It's on the tip of their tongue and they probably actually do know.
Yeah.
They could probably give us the right answer. But even if you do have the right answer, it's going to short wire us. We're going to short circuit. So that being curious, that asking like what else is there and giving us the time to get there is so incredibly important. I've beat myself up before because I've had a conversation with Becca about something. I responded quickly. And afterwards, and we're talking a day later, I'm like, actually, like, that kind of upset me. I wasn't feeling it in the moment. I was just like, okay, cool. That sounds good, babe. Like, there was something about a scheduling or something like that. It's like, yeah, sounds great. But it took me about a half a day or maybe even a full day to like figure out that actually bothered me. Yeah. And so I had to go back to her and say like, hey, babe, like, that conversation we had the other day, like, it actually really bothered me that like that came up in the way it did. And she's like, well, why didn't you tell me then? And I was like, why didn't I tell her then? Like,
I don't know what I'm feeling half the time.
What is wrong with me that I didn't bring that up? Am I not feeling and it sent me down a spiral for a moment because I was like, am I not secure enough in the relationship? Am I like, was I afraid to say something? Was I too weak to say something? But like, really, I didn't fully know at that moment. Yeah. It took me a day to like really come to the terms with like, yeah, this is actually how I'm feeling. Yep. So we don't always have it on the tip of our tongue, but we can get there when given time.
And that's why this space and time, right, to feel into our feelings. And sometimes that means like, I just need to disconnect from this emotional situation so I can go and feel what it is that I am feeling. Now, guys, here's your part of the responsibility in that equation. Is if you're going to be asking for space and time to go away and process, you better come back. Like one of the things that we see all the time is that guys go, I need space, I need time to think about it, and then never re-engage. Or they'll come back half-assed or be like, you know what, I'm tired of talking about this. And then you're, of course, never going to be entrusted to go away and have that space because you've proven before that you're just going away to disconnect and you have no intentions of coming back. One of my more popular Instagram posts is around why do some men need space during conflict? And a lot of women comment on it and they're like, thank you for helping me understand that, hey, maybe sometimes he doesn't want to blow up and say something that he can't take back, or maybe he does do better when he has time to just kind of tap into himself and feel and then come back. But what about the guy who just never comes back? There are plenty of those guys who don't ever come back. And if you are truly asking for space, then you need to be ready to re-engage from a resourceful place and to sit down on the same side of the table with your romantic partner to work that shit out.
There's an underlying belief with guys, especially if we don't have the tools, that like time heals everything.
Right.
And so what we do in these situations is we're in a heated moment. I need time. I'm going to walk away. Good job, Bryan. You did it again. You didn't blow up, right? So I go away, and then, I don't want to go back into that fire.
That's how a lot of guys solve their problems with each other. If you think about it, it's just like, you know what? Let's not talk about it. Are we cool? Yeah, we're cool.
We're good.
Yeah. And then we don't, but we're not.
We're not. So I can guarantee you, like that, the reason it's a false belief is because that will come up again.
Yes.
And it'll probably be worse than the first time. Okay. And in doing that, going to what you said, Dominic, is we're losing trust with our partner. And so now we become a less trustworthy guy. So if we're going to take time, understand that the time is not going to heal what's going on. We have to come back to the table.
So those are 3 and 4. Don't interrupt when I'm sharing my emotions. Keep asking, is there anything else? Is there anything else? Get to the bottom of it. And then give us space and time to process and articulate our feelings that may be more complex. And guys, make sure you come back. And also, if you're asking not to be interrupted, you also have to give that same courtesy to your partner when it's her turn to share. Don't interrupt her. Also ask, is there anything else? The 5th and final thing that we heard men asking for with respect to being vulnerable, this is a big one. Don't try to change me. Let me be who I am. Now, we see so many times where women enter relationships, and we go and speak to panels of women, masterminds of women, are always like, I see my guy. He's got so much potential. If he would only ... fill in the blank. Or he's got this greatness inside of him, but this is the thing he's interested in. And if you just stop focusing on video games or the stock market or whatever, then he could be that guy. How do I get him to be that guy? Maybe he just has no interest in being that guy. Maybe he's showing to you exactly who he is. Maybe he does have more potential and he'll never go after it. Maybe he sees something that you don't see. And maybe he's lit up by something that you're not lit up by. Maybe he likes cars. Maybe he loves sports. And for whatever reason, like you don't, and you want to take his focus off of that, but that's the thing that lights his fire. Don't try to change him. We are in the business of change and transformation, you and me. And I've learned very quickly that if I try to change a guy who doesn't want to be changed, we both end up disappointed and pissed off at each other. I'm only engaging with the men who are interested in something more for themselves, who have like already demonstrated and have proof that they're on that path. For women who are looking at the men in their lives, you have to look at yourself. And if you find yourself in relationships where you're constantly trying to change someone, constantly disappointed by someone who's underwhelming and not living up to the standard, just like you looked at your 9 straight relationships of feeling suffocated, there may be a pattern that you need to look at too around why are you always trying to change somebody? So we heard this, I think, thematically, I would say probably about a dozen guys who are like, can you just let me be who I am? And that in and of itself allows for an acceptance that most of us are just craving and yearning for. Like, can you accept me as I am and speak to me as I am, while also maybe speaking to the king that's in me as well, but let me ascend to that in my rightful time and way.
And here's the beautiful secret. If we can just be who we are, the chances of us changing is higher.
Much higher. Yeah, that's the irony.
We can evolve, and we will evolve, right? I would say most guys are in a place where as long as we feel safe and comfortable being who we are, there will be a natural inclination to grow, to change, to evolve. But the moment, the instant that we don't feel good enough or we need to be changed or we're compared against someone else, we will fight. Do not change me. I like who I am. Like, if you don't like this, then goodbye.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And this is a visceral response. So the moment we feel, and I don't think, by the way, this is just a guy thing. I think this is more of a human thing. When somebody can see like, hey, like there's something in you that needs a change, right? Like, oh man, we will fight that tooth and nail. Totally. So it's not to say that we won't or can't or don't desire to change, but if we're busy fighting that,
yep,
there's no room to move.
There's no room. Yeah, I mean, we can sniff out an agenda from a mile away, right? If you're trying to push us into a particular place, or if you're trying to subtly chip away at the things that we love or, that we take an interest in, we can feel that agenda and then we will fight it. And so I think most guys, at least from what we've heard, and certainly from our own experiences, like, I don't want to be changed. I want someone who loves me for who I am, who sees my greatness, who sees the path that I'm on, and certainly can help me illuminate blind spots and maybe help to remove some of the barriers to the places that I would like to go. Or you can play a little game with me and maybe there's something that you see I'm not quite interested in yet, but seduce me. Turn me on to it. Make it my choice. It's not like an ultimatum or you have to do it this way, but play with me a little bit. And maybe over the course of time, like I'll be turned on by it.
Yeah. And I posit that if our partners are doing steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 correctly, you have to worry less about number five.
Yeah, you're right.
Because those areas are going to be natural areas of growth. If I'm really being vulnerable with you and you're really being open and curious to it without being triggered and worrying about you, those are moments for growth. Right. So like it's almost like playing a little bit of the long game versus like this has to be fixed right now. That will lead to growth and change. It has in my life exponentially.
Love that. And as we have with each of these other 5, let's talk about a man's responsibility in this equation. So if you want to be accepted, right, for who you are, then a part of that is to unfold your arms and to let down the sword and the shield and to be open and receptive to invitations from your partner, right? So you have those guys who are so closed-minded, who are just like, this is who I am, never going to change, right? And there's like that false sense of pride, which is really, in some cases, kind of like an ignorance and I think a fear around looking at yourself at a deeper level. So if you can relax and ease that and just say, all right, I don't want to be changed. I don't want to be manipulated, right? Like I'm clear on that, but I am open to the invitation to be called forward. I am open to the invitation to raise my standards in my time in the way that feels good for me. So if you want to be accepted for who you are, the irony is a part of it is being open and receptive to being called forward.
I have a little tool. Let's say I was with a partner and steps 1 through 5 here that we just talked through, or numbers 1 through 5 that we just talked through. Let's say they were all hit. Like everything went wrong. It's going to be really hard for me to receive any kind of message around change.
Right.
That said, we're living in reality, and sometimes these things happen. And sometimes there's some truth in what's being shared. The tool that I use that allows my ego to sit down for just a second is, I call it the 1% rule. And the question that I ask myself when something is coming at me is like, could 1% of what's being said be true?
Yeah.
And if it is, then there's probably something to learn and grow from.
That's right.
Sometimes there's not 1% truth. This is bullshit. It's projection. It's whatever. And this is not a thing I need to even entertain. Right. But oftentimes when I look at just the 1%, there's a few more percentage points in there that I can learn from.
That's right. Yeah. Your initial trigger may be like, that's unfair. And maybe 95% of it is not true. But if there's 1% truth or 5% truth, you're like, okay, there's something in here to learn from, which makes you more receptive. Right. And that's a partnership, right? Then there's intimacy, then there's connection, then there's both sides being able to feel seen and heard and understood. So to recap this list of, the 5 things that men have been asking for to be more vulnerable with the women in their romantic partnerships. The first one is, can you listen to me without judgment? Number 2 is, when I share with you, don't over the top me, right? If you're truly holding the space for me, then hold that space for me and don't out emotion me, even if I trigger you. Number 3 is, don't interrupt me and ask me, is there anything else? Get to the bottom of it. Number 4, please give me some space and time to process and articulate my complex feelings. And guys, if you're going to ask for that, then you have to come back to the table, resourced, ready to talk. And the 5th one we just talked about, which is, don't try to change me. And guys, with that, there's a responsibility to be open and receptive to dancing together and creating that future with one another. Hey, just a little reminder that at the top of every one of our show notes in every episode, there are invitations for you to come deeper into the community of men doing inner work here with the Great Man Within. Today, I have the link for Instagram, which is where I post every single day my best thoughts, what I'm thinking about with respect to how to live as a purpose-driven man. The second is a link to join the Facebook community for men only, which is a growing community of 750 plus men, where we're sharing our stories of inner work, discussing the episodes. And then finally, if you are interested in exploring what it'd be like to join a community of men, I've got a link to the digital mastermind that has all the details of what this 12-month investment of becoming the best version of yourself with a community of other guys who are striving to do the same looks like. It has the curriculum, the investment financials, and anything else you would want to know to schedule a call with us and potentially explore joining. So that's the top of our show notes, and click away.